my name's Helena Turner. I'm one of the volunteers here at Lynde House, and welcome to the kitchen. Today I'm going to show you how to make mincemeat pies. This would have been something that Clarissa as well as Elmina would have made here in the Lynde kitchen. It's a very popular pie to use at the holiday seasons. They would have both made these pies, maybe using different traditions, because Clarissa would have made the pies around the 1820s and Elmina would have been more closer into the 50s and 60s. Mincemeat's been around for a very, very long time. Back into the 15th century, we look at them in recipes. Basically, it means to mince things. Traditionally, mincemeat does contain meat. Clarissa would have used a book like this. This is The Art of Cookery by Hannah Glass, and in it is a recipe for mincemeat. The interesting thing about cookbooks, this is a reproduction, but the cookbooks back then is that people knew how to cook, so they did not give you instructions on amounts, too much, or how to actually cook something. A lot of things were measured in pounds, and a lot of the recipes would make a very, very large amount. Traditionally, in this one from Hannah Glass, they say the meat that they're going to use is going to be tongue or some nice beef. Elmina would have used a book like this. This is the Home Cook Book. Again, it's a reproduction, and this one was put out by Sick Children's Hospital in the 1860s. So she would have used a recipe from here. And in this book, because this is a book made up of multiple recipes that people sent in, like one of your church cookbooks may have done this as well. There are like a dozen recipes on how to make mincemeat. So they would have had these books to use as their recipes, or just family traditions on how to make mincemeat. So mincemeat dates back to the 15th century, and in the earlier centuries it was mostly savory because it did contain a lot of meat, and they used wine and vinegars in it. By the 18th century, they are now putting in distilled spirits, brandy, rum, things like that, and they're increasing the amounts of sugar in it. So now it's becoming less and less like a savory and more like a dessert. By the 19th century, this is when we find the introduction more of apples. So apples are now replacing a lot of the meat, and we're now also using just the suet as the meat rather than actual meat pieces in the mincemeat. So I chose a recipe for mincemeat that's more of a modern recipe. The older cookbooks are more difficult to decipher because they don't always give certain amounts. A lot of times it's in weights and measures. It doesn't give you how long to cook things. You can go with a lot of modern recipes now. The one advantage is you can, even if you decide not to make your own mincemeat, you can actually purchase mincemeat in a store. So it comes in cans or in jars already prepared, but we want to do it the way that it was done back in the 1800s. People are still making their own mincemeat now. So this mincemeat contains 2 cups of ground suet. Now, suet is something that's a little difficult to get nowadays. I get my suet from the British bakery shop. You can get suet at some grocery stores. You have to be careful though. Sometimes they cut it with some flour, so it may not have the texture that you're looking for. Or if you have a butcher of your own, you can ask him to save the suet for you. The suet from the 1800s comes from the fat around the kidney of the beef or the pig. And this is the best suet to get. And you would use it and chop it fine. And like I said, minced meat, it means everything is chopped fine. So the meat would be chopped fine. The suet is chopped fine. All of the fruits and vegetables are chopped fine. So we have 2 cups of the suet, and then we have 3 cups of brown sugar. We mentioned in the 1800s that we're now using apples. So you're going to peel, core, and chop fine 5 cups of apples. This recipe calls for 2 cups of raisins and 2 cups of currants. Dried fruit would have been readily available, but the raisins would have come with seeds in them, and you would have had to remove the seeds. You're also going to use 1.5 cups of mixed peel. Back in the 1800s, when you had some citrus, you would save all of that peel from your citrus, your oranges and your lemons. You would boil it down a couple of times to get the bitterness out of it. You would then candy it, so boil it in some sugar syrup, and then you would have let it dry. And then you would have stored it away for when you were doing your baking. Another item you would add to your candied peel would be something called citron. Now, citron would be something that they would get quite often back in the 1800s. There's 2 types of citron. There is one that is more of a medieval one. It's from the Mediterranean, and it looks like a larger lemon, very bumpy on the outside, and it's very acidic. We here have much more difficulty getting it here. But what we had more availability would have been melon citron, which looks more like a watermelon. It's green and white, and it comes in different sizes. It grows quite readily, and about this size, and it's very hard. And they last a long time, and you would cut it up, and what you want to use, you would peel it and take out the inner part, which is, again, not soft like our regular watermelon. And what you're going to use is the rind part, which is quite thick. Citron doesn't have much flavor of its own. So again, you're going to candy it, cook it in sugar syrup, and store it away. And then when you go to do your baking, you're going to chop it fine. The next ingredient is some white vinegar, and you're going to use 1/2 cup of white vinegar. And then you're going to have your spices. So in this recipe, they call for 1 teaspoon of cinnamon, 1 teaspoon of nutmeg, 1/4 teaspoon of cloves, and 1/2 teaspoon of salt. You wouldn't get ground spices. You would use a mortar and pestle to grind all of your spices. Once you've got all of these together, you're going to mix it all together. And now you need to chop it fine. So earlier in the century, you would chop this by hand. Later in the century, things like the meat grinder was invented, or a pickle grinder. These could be used for all sorts of things. But it's a handle. You put your product in here, and then you grind it, and it comes out all mixed together. Nowadays, we have food processors. Makes life a lot easier. So we can just put it all into the food processor and grind it, and then we end up with our minced meat. At this point, once you've minced everything, you can now cook it down. And you want to cook it down until it comes to the consistency of the paste that you want to put into your pie or into your tarts. For me, I cooked it down to get the consistency that I put into that pie about 1/2 hour. And at that point, then I can decide whether I'm going to can it, just leave it in the refrigerator until needed for about a month, or am I going to put it into the freezer? Mincemeat pies can be quite complicated. They're a multi-step process. You have to actually make the mincemeat. Then you also have to make the pastry. And the mincemeat then could also be canned. Once you make the mincemeat, then you're going to preserve it. So preserving back in the 1800s would have been done a little different than what we do now. Canning nowadays, we use something like this. This is a typical canner that you would use, and you would boil it on the stove for approximately the amount of time that you need. For this mincemeat recipe, if you're making a 250 milliliter jar, which is approximately about this size, then a 1 cup size, you're going to boil it for 20 minutes. If you're making a 500 milliliter jar, which is this size, which I do have my mincemeat in, you're going to boil it for 30 minutes. and then you need to let it rest. The other thing you can do now with canning is you can actually freeze things. So in my canner here, I have a container that you can buy, again, a 1 cup size, that you can put things in and put them in the freezer. So we have a lot of options now that the Lyndes did not have back in the 1800s. The Lyndes, what they would have done is, in the earlier part of the century, they would have put things into crocks. And so I have a couple of crocks here. So you would pack things into crocks to preserve them, and a little smaller one for possibly jam. And then they would use a big one like this, would have like a wooden lid or actually a ceramic lid that would come with it. But a small one like this. And at the time too, you would still have jars available. So they could have jars available, not this nice fancy jar, but nice clear jars. And they would use those as well. And what they would do is, to preserve things, is when you pack the food into it, you would then put a pig's bladder, right? So when we talk about that, they would save all the parts of all of the meat when they used it, and they would use the pig's bladder to cover it, because when it dried, it would shrink really tight against the container. The other thing that they would use would be brandied paper. So you would wet the paper with brandy and then tie it on top of your jar. So those were 2 ways of preserving things for them to last longer. In 1858, John Mason invents the first canning jar with a screw-top lid. Now, a lot of these jars, this one is actually a crown jar that's more popular here, and they would come with a matching glass lid that you would use. And so these were invented in 1858. In 1884, John Mason's patent has run out. And so now it's open for other companies now to start making these canning jars. So Ball is another popular company. And in 1884, the Ball company starts making canning jars as well. So once you've made your mincemeat, either kept it in the fridge or you've canned it, or you've decided to use it right away, I've preserved mine. I'm now going to put it into my pie. So, oh, nice pop, right? We know that that was a well-sealed container, and that's something you want to look for when you are doing some canning. And I'm going to put the mincemeat into the pie. Now this is about 2 cups, so 500 mLs. And for this size of a pie, this is just the perfect amount. Now, mincemeat pies always have 2 layers. You always would have a top on your mincemeat pie. So this mincemeat has been cooked down. There we go. And now you need to bake it off. So in the 1800s, here in the Lynde kitchen, you would have had a couple of options on how to bake this pie. In the early 1800s, Clarissa would have used this hearth to cook her meals. A lot of hearths have a bake oven on either side, one of the sides of the fireplace. This one doesn't. So how would Clarissa bake her pies, her cakes, her bread? Well, they would have had something called a bake kettle, and this is a bake kettle. And what you do is you would bring the coals out from the hearth, and you would put your bake kettle on top of the coals to heat it up. When it got to the temperature that you think it should be, then you would remove the lid, and they would have had a metal rod tool that would hook into the handle that they could pull straight up. I'm just going to put my pie into the bake kettle, and they would have had a trivet on the bottom. And then they would have scooped more fresh coals to put down again for the bottom. New coals to put on the top. As you can see, there's a little bit of a lip on the lid. And you would have baked any baked goods in a bake kettle. When the timing was right, and a good cook would know, sometimes by the smell, but when I've done the cooking, I just smell fire. I don't necessarily smell something until it starts to burn. But they would again take that metal rod out, hook it into the lid, pull it straight up with the coals still on it, hoping not to spill any of those coals onto your nice baked items. So by the mid-1800s and about 1860s, now you've moved to wood stoves. And again, you would need wood, but it's much more convenient, and you would have had an oven to bake all of your baked goods in. One of the steps that you need to do when you're making your pie is actually making your pastry or your paste. Again, any good cook in the 1800s would have a lot of different recipes how to make pastry. I am not a pastry person. Pies making is not my forte, but I have a go-to one. I usually use the recipe that's on the back of the vegetable shortening package. It works out for me every time. I tend to usually use lard-based pastries, but this particular pastry that I use today is a vegetable shortening. You can also use butter in your pastries as well, depending on the people that you're planning to serve this pie to and what their tastes are. You have to have a bottom and a top crust. And so you would make your pastry, and then you would roll it out fine and then put it into your pie shell. Now this pie will then also receive a top crust, and I will then also cut some strips into it to let the air escape. And it's going to bake in a 400-degree oven for approximately 30 to 35 minutes in your modern oven. Everyone's oven works different. Keep an eye on it, and good luck with making your mincemeat pie. So as you can see here, we have our finished pie that we're going to serve at any occasion. Why would you want mincemeat? Are there other things you can make with mincemeat? Of course! You can make mincemeat tarts and also little hand pies. Anything that has a filling can be used with mincemeat. You can put it in a cake. You can put it in a loaf. You can put it in a rolled cookie. Anything that has filling in it, you could roll it in that. So if you are a mincemeat fan, feel free to make some mincemeat and enjoy the taste of the seasons. Well, thank you for joining me today, and I hope you enjoyed this little video about mincemeat. I invite you to come and visit us here at the Lynde house, and I'll be looking forward to seeing you.